Have you ever walked into a room feeling perfectly fine, only to leave feeling emotionally exhausted without knowing why? Have you ever spent time around someone who seemed negative, angry, anxious, or emotionally chaotic, and suddenly found yourself carrying emotions that didn't even feel like your own? Have you ever wondered why certain people leave you drained while others leave you energized? If so, there is a good chance you're experiencing something many empaths struggle with every single day, absorbing negative energy. And the scary part is that most empaths don't even realize it's happening. They think they're stressed. They think they're overwhelmed. They think they're emotionally unstable. But often, they're carrying emotions that never belonged to them in the first place. This is one of the most overlooked struggles of being an empath. Because while empathy is often portrayed as a gift, very few people talk about the hidden cost that comes with it. The cost of constantly feeling everything. The cost of constantly sensing emotional shifts. The cost of constantly absorbing the energy of the people around you. And if you don't learn how to protect yourself, this ability can slowly consume your peace, your confidence, and even your identity. The truth is, empaths don't just listen to words. They feel emotions. They notice changes in tone, changes in energy, changes in facial expressions, changes in body language, changes that most people completely miss. An empath can walk into a room and immediately sense tension without anyone saying a single word. They can feel sadness behind a smile, anger behind politeness, fear behind confidence. And while this awareness can create deep understanding, it can also create a dangerous habit. The habit of carrying emotions that were never theirs to carry. Think about how often you've been around someone who was angry. At first, you're calm. Then after spending enough time with them, you notice your own mood changing. You become irritated, restless, uncomfortable. Not because anything happened to you, because emotions are contagious. And empaths are especially sensitive to emotional environments. Many people underestimate how powerful this effect can be. The human brain is constantly reading social cues, constantly scanning for emotional information, constantly adjusting based on the environment. But empaths tend to do this at a much deeper level. Their emotional radar rarely turns off. And while that makes them compassionate, it also makes them vulnerable. Vulnerable to emotional overload, vulnerable to toxic environments, vulnerable to people who constantly project negativity onto others. One of the biggest mistakes empaths make is assuming that every emotion they feel belongs to them. This creates confusion because they wake up feeling anxious and assume something is wrong with them. They suddenly feel drained and assume they're weak. They experience emotional heaviness and assume they're broken. What they fail to ask is a simple question. Is this actually mine? That question can change everything, because sometimes the sadness you're feeling isn't yours. Sometimes the anxiety isn't yours. Sometimes the anger isn't yours. Sometimes the emotional chaos isn't yours. Sometimes you've simply absorbed it from the people around you. The problem becomes even worse when empaths spend large amounts of time around emotionally unhealthy individuals. People who constantly complain, people who constantly criticize, people who constantly create drama, people who constantly see themselves as victims, people who seem to carry negativity wherever they go. These individuals often don't realize the impact they have. But empaths feel it every single day. Imagine being a sponge. Every conversation absorbs something. Every conflict absorbs something. Every emotional interaction absorbs something. Now imagine never squeezing that sponge out, never releasing what you've collected, never separating your emotions from everyone else's. Eventually, the sponge becomes saturated, heavy, overwhelmed, unable to absorb anything else. That is exactly what happens to many empaths. They become emotionally overloaded, not because they are weak, because they were never taught how to protect their energy. For years, they believe being a good person means being available to everyone, listening to everyone, helping everyone, saving everyone, supporting everyone. But eventually, they discover a painful truth. You cannot pour endlessly into others while ignoring yourself. At some point, exhaustion becomes unavoidable. One of the earliest signs that an empath is absorbing too much negative energy is emotional fatigue. You feel tired even when you've done very little physically. Your body may be resting, but your emotions feel exhausted. You start craving isolation, not because you dislike people, because your nervous system desperately needs recovery. Many empaths feel guilty about this. They think needing space means they're selfish, but that's not what's happening. They're depleted. They're carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to begin with. Another sign is unexplained mood shifts. You feel fine one moment, then suddenly overwhelmed, anxious, irritated, sad, confused. Nothing obvious happened, yet your emotional state completely changed. Often this happens after exposure to another person's emotional energy. The challenge is that empaths frequently internalize these experiences. Instead of recognizing outside influences, they blame themselves. And self-blame creates an even heavier burden, because now they're carrying both the original emotion and the belief that something is wrong with them. Over time, this pattern becomes dangerous. The empath starts losing touch with their own emotional identity. They become so focused on everyone else's feelings that they stop recognizing their own. They know what everyone around them needs, what everyone around them feels, what everyone around them wants, but when someone asks them what they need, they don't know how to answer. That is a warning sign, because an empath who loses connection with themselves becomes vulnerable to manipulation, vulnerable to toxic relationships, vulnerable to emotional burnout. And unfortunately, certain people are naturally drawn to individuals like this. People who need constant validation, people who need endless emotional support, people who consume energy without replenishing it. At first, the empath feels needed, valued, important. But eventually the relationship becomes draining. The empath gives. The other person takes. The empath gives more. The other person takes more. Until one day the empath realizes they're running on empty. The frightening part is that this often happens so gradually that they don't notice until they're already exhausted. And that exhaustion creates a silent transformation. A moment where the empath begins questioning everything. Why am I always tired? Why do certain people drain me? Why do I feel responsible for everyone's emotions? Why do I feel guilty when I prioritize myself? Those questions are the beginning of awareness, and awareness is powerful, because once an empath becomes aware of what's happening, they can begin reclaiming their energy. They can begin separating their emotions from everyone else's. They can begin recognizing that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. But before that healing can happen, they must first understand the hidden reason they absorb so much negativity in the first place. And that reason is far deeper than most people realize. Because the truth is, most empaths were not taught how to separate caring from caring. Somewhere along the way, they learned that being a good person meant taking responsibility for other people's emotions. If someone was hurting, they felt responsible for helping. If someone was upset, they felt responsible for fixing it. If someone was struggling, they felt responsible for carrying part of the burden. At first, this seems compassionate, and in moderation, it can be. But over time, that habit creates a dangerous pattern. The empath stops distinguishing between understanding someone's pain and absorbing someone's pain. They become so emotionally connected to other people's experiences that they start treating those experiences as their own. Imagine standing beside someone caught in a storm. Empathy allows you to recognize their struggle. It allows you to understand their discomfort. It allows you to offer support. But many empaths don't stop there. Instead of standing beside the person, they walk directly into the storm. They become soaked by emotions that were never theirs to carry. And after years of doing this, they begin wondering why they feel so exhausted, why they feel emotionally overwhelmed, why they feel drained even after doing nothing physically demanding. The answer is simple. They've been carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to them. One of the biggest turning points in an empath's life happens when they finally understand this distinction. Understanding someone's pain is not the same as owning it. Supporting someone is not the same as saving them. Loving someone is not the same as sacrificing your own well-being. Those truths may sound obvious, But for many empaths, they are life-changing because they challenge beliefs that have existed for years, beliefs that convinced them they had to be available all the time, beliefs that convinced them they had to fix everyone, beliefs that convinced them their worth came from how much they could give. The moment those beliefs begin breaking apart, something remarkable happens. The empath starts reclaiming their energy, not by becoming selfish, not by becoming cold, by becoming aware. Awareness changes everything, because once you recognize what is happening, you stop operating on autopilot. You start asking different questions. When anxiety appears, you ask, where did this come from? When sadness appears, you ask, is this mine? When emotional heaviness appears, you ask, what have I been exposed to recently? Those questions create distance, and distance creates clarity. Instead of immediately absorbing emotions, the empath begins observing them. Instead of becoming consumed by emotional energy, they become curious about it. That shift is incredibly powerful because awareness interrupts automatic absorption. The empath begins noticing patterns. They notice that certain environments always leave them exhausted. Certain conversations always leave them drained. Certain people always leave them emotionally depleted. And once those patterns become visible, boundaries start becoming necessary. This is often where empaths struggle the most, because boundaries feel uncomfortable, especially for people who have spent years prioritizing everyone else. Many empaths worry that boundaries make them selfish. They worry that saying no will hurt people. They worry that creating distance means they don't care. But boundaries are not a rejection of compassion. They are protection for compassion. Without boundaries, empathy becomes exhaustion. Without boundaries, kindness becomes self-neglect. Without boundaries, generosity becomes emotional depletion. Think about a phone battery. No matter how advanced the phone is, it eventually needs recharging. If you constantly use it without allowing it to recharge, it dies. The same principle applies to emotional energy. Empaths often spend years giving without recharging, listening without recovering, helping without resting, supporting without replenishing. Eventually, the emotional battery reaches critical levels, and that's when burnout begins. Burnout doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly. A lack of motivation, a loss of excitement, a constant feeling of emotional heaviness, a desire to withdraw from everyone, a sense that you have nothing left to give. Many empaths mistakenly interpret this as failure, but often it's simply a signal that their emotional system has been overloaded for too long. The good news is that burnout is not the end. In many cases, it's the beginning of transformation, because burnout forces awareness. It forces the empath to examine how they've been living, how they've been giving, how they've been protecting or failing to protect their energy. And that awareness creates change. The empath starts becoming more selective, not about who deserves kindness, about who receives access. There is a difference. Kindness can remain unlimited. Access cannot. This realization is one of the most empowering lessons an empath ever learns. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your emotional energy. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your attention. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your peace. Learning that doesn't make you less compassionate. It makes your compassion sustainable. The empath begins noticing something fascinating. The more they protect their energy, the more peaceful they become. The more peaceful they become, the clearer they think. The clearer they think, the easier it becomes to recognize unhealthy dynamics, and the easier it becomes to walk away from them. This creates a version of the empath that many people never expected. A version that still cares deeply, still loves deeply, still understands deeply, but no longer absorbs everything, no longer carries everyone, no longer confuses compassion with responsibility. This version of the empath is stronger, not because they have fewer emotions, because they have healthier boundaries. They understand now that they cannot heal everyone, cannot rescue everyone, cannot save everyone. And most importantly, they understand that it was never their job to do so. Their responsibility is not to carry the world. Their responsibility is to care for themselves while offering support where they can. That balance changes everything. Because when an empath finally learns how to separate their emotions from everyone else's, they stop drowning in emotional chaos. They stop feeling responsible for every problem. They stop blaming themselves for every negative feeling they encounter. And perhaps for the first time in their life, they experience something they may have been missing for years: peace, real peace. The kind of peace that comes from understanding where you end and where other people begin. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you can care without carrying, love without losing yourself, support without sacrificing yourself, empathize without absorbing everything. That is the lesson every empath eventually needs to learn. Because your gift was never meant to destroy you. Your gift was meant to connect you to others. But it can only do that when you remain connected to yourself. And the moment you learn that difference, everything changes. You stop becoming a sponge for negativity. You stop becoming a container for everyone else's pain. And you finally become what you were always meant to be: a compassionate person who understands emotions without being controlled by them. A person who can love deeply without losing themselves. A person who can stand in the middle of someone else's storm without feeling obligated to drown in it. And that is the moment an empath truly becomes free.